The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 4. Friends. Abraham walked with David on the well-maintained dirt road that circled around the square plot of grass in the center of town that contained the statue of Gerald Hoggins. The town was alive with people walking between the shops and their homes. Abraham loved it and could not see his life or his future any differently. He knew where he was and where he was going, unlike David, who seemed to be abysmally disappointed. In fact, Abraham noticed, David was still staring at the ground, lost in his own little world of never-ending disappointment. Abraham shook his head, wondering how someone with so much going for him could be so down on it all. He could take no more of it. "If you don't stop brooding, cousin," he said, "I'll put you out of your misery." "You know I hate this," David sighed. "Is this still the tailor thing?" Abraham asked, knowing the answer already. "What do you think?" David asked. "Do you even know what you want anymore?" Abraham asked in return. "One day you want nothing to do with it, and the next you're wishing that your father would focus some energy on you instead of Mark and James." David began, but he stopped and shrugged. "I don't know," he said finally. "Do you ever feel like you're just not made for something, no matter how hard you try?" Abraham shook his head resolutely. He knew what he was made for, and the life his father had laid out for him was everything that he wanted. "My profession," Abraham said, and he definitely meant his profession, "is a combination of old alchemy and modern hairstyling. Cut their hair and keep them alive, my father says. Hardly boring." And he meant that, although he much preferred the mixing of the chemical ingredients to make the various medicines that his father's shop provided to the ailing over their more common task of cutting people's hair. But one must take the good with the bad, the boring with the interesting. And it was the lot of a barber to handle those types of needs. "So you're satisfied?" David asked. "I would say so," Abraham said, nodding. "It's not as if we're going to see the world or anything." He looked at David, who shrugged. "We might," David said. Abraham shook his head. Did David really think they would go somewhere else, create some other life? The people who had founded Hogginstown were trying to get away from the wars and conflicts that continued unceasingly in the world. They had never experienced any of it because they were so far away from everything else. No one in modern Hogginstown even knew what country would claim them, since boundaries continue to change so often, or so his father had told him of the world. They could acknowledge that they were in Europe, but as to a country they did not care. The affairs of the world were of no concern to them, and they preferred to keep their distance from everyone else. The nearest town Abraham had heard of was Frenton, but he had never been there. Others had moved there to start their own businesses away from their older siblings who had taken over the local family business. He feared this would be David's destiny, and it scared him. The very thought of leaving this peaceful town to see a warlike world was a thought that Abraham could not even begin to fathom. "Sure," Abraham said, acknowledging David's supposed hopefulness. "If you're not a tailor here, you'll be a tailor somewhere else. You'll settle down with your little wife and stay in the same little town your whole little life. Just like I will. Just like our families have. Just like everyone else in this town," David said quickly. "I know. I need to swallow my pride or something." It sounded as if David was reciting the words, and sure, it was something they had talked about before. Far too often for Abraham's taste. He needed to change the subject. As they continued walking their circle around the town square, Abraham glanced around and noticed a girl behind them carrying a large ball of yarn. He smiled as he saw her walking very quickly toward them, passing several older women who regarded her with disapproval as she held her dress off the ground with one hand and sped across the town square. She was also 17, with a bright, energetic face, long brown hair, deep brown eyes, and a smile to die for. If anyone could change the subject effectively, she could. She was dressed in a simple blue and white dress with a white cap, both of which she had made herself under the tutelage of David's mother. Every time she joined them, Abraham's heart fluttered just a little. Abraham looked at David. "Well," Abraham said, "at least you know who you're going to end up with." David looked up in surprise. "What?" "Good day, you two," the girl said as she caught up to them. "Good afternoon, Beth," Abraham greeted her. "Hey, Beth," David said. "David, Abraham, what are you two doing?" she asked. Here it was, the opportunity Abraham wanted. If anyone would get David back to reality, it would be Elizabeth Carpenter. "Oh, you know," Abraham said, "just brooding over a dull future." Of course, Abraham did not believe his future was dull, but it evoked the response from Beth that he wanted. The three of them had been friends their entire lives, a known trio in Hogginstown, where one was rarely seen without the other two. Like Abraham, Beth held her future as exceptionally hopeful, and she looked forward to the very life that David was brooding over. "Dull," she said incredulously. "Come on, life is out there. What could possibly be dull about it?" "Well, this isn't so much me as you're intended here," Abraham informed her. Beth's eyes grew wide. "Abraham, hush," she said in a whisper. David gave him a dirty look that also requested silence on this particular topic. Abraham was well aware of their desire to keep their courtship secret, but he also felt that David needed at least to acknowledge how lucky he was to have Beth at his side. He knew that if he were in David's position, he would never be unhappy again. "David's got you," Abraham said to Beth, "and I have Mary Dillinger, the singular biggest eyesore in this God-forsaken town. If I ever had one reason to get out of here—" Not that he intended to go anywhere, and Mary Dillinger was fairly attractive in her own right. Her family moved into Hogginstown within the last 15 years, so most people considered them outsiders. But his father had befriended hers, and she was only a few years younger than he was. By the time he would be self-sufficient in his father's trade, she would be of age, and they would be encouraged to marry. "Abraham, you know better than to—" Beth began, pulling Abraham out of his thoughts. "I know you're trying to avoid public scrutiny," Abraham interrupted her, "but don't you think people will figure it out?" "Not as long as certain people keep their mouths closed about it," David finally said out of his silence. "This gossip-laden town does not need to know about us yet." "They'll figure it out," Abraham insisted. "How?" David asked. "We've been friends forever, and you'd be as big a suspect as I would. Besides, we're well known as a threesome right now." "And that's the way it will stay until we're ready as well," Beth added. Wait a minute, Abraham thought. Did she really just say that? Surely Beth did not believe that their lives would change as a group. After all, if Mary Dillinger came into his life, he would never think of leaving his friends of so many years. "I know life will go on," Abraham said, "but we're not going to break up the threesome, are we?" Beth smiled at him, looking a bit sad. Or was it condescending? Abraham was unable to decipher her, but a nervous flutter rattled his stomach, telling him that he was bound to dislike whatever she was going to say. "Be realistic, Abraham," she said. "We're friends forever, but life will make a twosome someday." Abraham stopped in his tracks. No, he did not like what she had said, but there it was. It was hard enough that David was going to have Beth, but knowing that once they ended up together, they would leave him behind made it all the worse. What is friends forever if they leave him? Is that what his friendship means to them? Abraham shook his head away from these thoughts. He was just overthinking it all because he was afraid of David and Beth leaving him alone someday. Going to Frenton, perhaps. He ran to catch back up to them. David and Beth were staring at each other, talking quietly. They stopped as Abraham reached them, and David turned to him. "Well, I do need to be getting back," David said. Abraham looked back to his father's barber's shop to find his father standing in front of it, looking at him. "Me too, by the looks of it," Abraham said. "Very well. See you later, Abraham," David said as he and Beth walked together back towards the alley. Abraham nodded, knowing they had left him alone. "Right," he said, watching them go. "I'll see you later." Beth turned to him with a smile and a wave. "Bye," she said, and then turned back forward, walking with David until they disappeared into the alley. David closed the gate behind them. Abraham sighed. He had no feelings for this married Dillinger that lay in his future because there was a lot of truth in what David had said. Abraham could be suspected as much as David in having Beth's heart. In truth, his heart had been with her since before she and David had privately declared their love for each other. He tried not to give it too much thought, however, since it would only lead him back to wondering how David was better than him. What was it about David that led Beth to him instead of Abraham? He shook his head and tried to clear these negative thoughts before returning to the barber shop. He turned back to his waiting father, his mind still reeling from how quickly they had gone from 3 kids who were always found together to a couple with an extra person. David and Beth had been extraordinarily discreet, however, and when they met, Abraham was usually there as well. It was their desire for everyone to see the 3 of them together before David and Beth left him and went somewhere else alone. They left it to Abraham to cover for them when they went, whether he wanted to or not. It was only a matter of time before they disappeared entirely, and left him alone with nothing to keep him company but his father's shop and an endless supply of needy people. Every time they disappeared, Abraham felt as if they took his heart with them. Beth finally had David alone. They were locked in a tight embrace behind the fence blocking the alley beside the tailor's store from the rest of the world, and she never wanted the moment to end. If they had announced their intentions for each other to the town, moments like this would never come. The entire town would scrutinize their every movement to ensure that young love didn't run away with itself. But if love didn't run, why bother with it? When the embrace broke, she looked into the eyes of the friend she had come to love over the years. How long had it been since she had first given her heart over to him? Long before she ever admitted it on her 15th birthday in this very place. She remembered the nervousness of that moment as she had timidly told him that she was very fond of him, and how he had shared those feelings. However, these past 2 years had been some of the most difficult for them as they had struggled to keep their love a secret after having seen how parents reacted to other couples in town once they made their intentions for each other known. They had told Abraham, and he seemed happy enough for them, though it took a few moments for the shock to wear off. He had also been good to both of them, as he continually covered for their movements when the 3 of them had been spending time together before her and David suddenly and inexplicably disappeared. It saddened her to consider that she and David might be using Abraham, and she wondered how long their friendship could possibly continue once she and David were actually married. What would become of the trio when 2 of them had become one? Naturally, they would all be lifelong friends, but everything would be different. She and David would want to spend time alone together, and they would not have the time they did now to include him. "I've been waiting all day for that," David said, interrupting her personal reverie. She smiled at him, taking in his face again. "Me too," she said. David looked down at her ball of uncolored wool yarn. "What's this for?" he asked. She laughed. That ball of yarn had taken her the better part of a week to spin on a spinning wheel that belonged to David's mother, Mary Taylor, who also served as the mantua-maker for the women of the town, a task that Mrs. Taylor was only too happy to teach to her. Beth also felt that someday she would join David's mother as the next Mrs. Taylor to be the next mantua-maker, since she was learning the art quickly and had even made her own dress and cap. She had been over at his house while he was at his father's shop almost every day working on her yarn from the wool she had gathered from the sheep at the Shepherd family's farm north of town. "I've been working on a blanket for 2 for whenever we get married," she said. "When that day finally comes, it should be done." "Sounds good," David said with a broad smile. He was always so encouraging of her notions of married life. It only further served to fuel her excitement of an engagement, hopefully sooner than later. "I can't wait until we're able to tell the world about us," she said, almost dancing in his arms, "just to be able to show them how we feel about each other." "We will," David said, "but now is not the time." She pouted. While she wanted the engagement, she was also unwilling to lose these little rendezvous with him. Between the public announcement and wedding, everyone would hardly allow them to talk privately without someone else close by watching them. "Can you come out tonight?" she asked him. "There's a ban on going out after dark," he reminded her. "Besides," he added with a smile, "it isn't entirely proper." Of course she knew this. She also knew he did not believe a word of the demon talk going on around town, and probably believed Ben was where they had stumbled on him the last time he came up missing. They were lucky in that no one had asked too many questions as to why David had suggested the old windmill as a possible location for Ben. She knew the truth, and it was nothing too complicated. As the windmill almost never had visitors, they tended to go there to be alone, and on that particular occasion they were not alone. They quickly returned to town, where she and David both went home immediately, and the next day, when everyone was discussing where to search for Ben, David had suggested the windmill as a place he might have ended up. She smiled as she remembered the cavalier way in which it had just come to him. "It's never stopped us before," she tossed back to him. David laughed and nodded. She leaned in close to him again. "I'll see you tonight, then?" They kissed again. She pulled him close to her and took in every part of him she could. It would be too long before they could be close again. The kiss broke, and she looked into his eyes. "Me and you, right?" he asked, as he often did. "For all eternity," she replied. "No matter what," he finished. It was their own parting greeting, and they had used it ever since it had come out at the end of a long day, and they were just barely out of earshot of their parents, and were unable to touch or use the normal "I love you" parting words without someone noticing them. To Beth, the words were sacred, and meant everything to her to hear him start it. She slowly backed away from him to the gate of the alley. With a final smile, she exited the alley back into the street. A quick look around showed that no one had so much as noticed them disappear, or were the least bit interested in a girl going into an alley alone with a boy. After all, they were David and Beth, the oldest of friends. A personal satisfaction at her secret still intact, she walked to her house, where she looked forward to another day and evening of knitting and preparing for the day that her parents thought was far off, and she knew was closer than anyone imagined.